Hello there. You've caught me at a great time. I'm almost done with my high tea. James? My name is Harold Tillingsworth III, and I am delighted that you've joined me again to watch yet another enlightening episode of the most intriguing military battles. Thank you, Lord Tillingsworth, and many thanks to you guys for coming back and spending time watching my channel. I'm Amelia, and today we continue exploring our special topic, the Arab-Israeli conflict. So, what makes this episode special? Well, typically, I research a military engagement that, in my opinion, has an interesting twist. From a strategic, tactical, political, or long-term historical perspective. This topic is special because it goes far beyond just one battle, or even one war. Moreover, we are still living through its consequences. While the sequences of military events are intriguing, they cannot be viewed in isolation. The military battles and events should be viewed in the context of an even more fascinating political spiderweb, which produced this conflict to begin with. Lastly, this story is very special because it is so rich in content, information, memoirs, and political leader profiles. Even after I broke it into 5 segments, I felt that I was missing way more than I was including. That being said, let's continue our exploration of this conflict. In the previous episode, we focused our attention on the civil war in Palestine in 1947 to 48, and spent a little time away from the dusty battlefields to trace the origin of this conflict. Click the link in the description box below to see the first episode of the series. Today, we pick up where we left off and focus on the first of the 4 major Arab-Israeli wars, the War of Independence, or, as it is known in the Arab world, Al-Nakba, the disaster. After months of bloody civil war between the Jewish Palestinians and the Arab population of this territory under the British Mandate, the last British soldier finally left Palestinian soil on May 14th of 1948. On that day, the Jewish leadership in Palestine proclaimed the formation of the independent state of Israel. Thus, on May 15th, the civil war between the Jews and Arabs of Palestine was over, and the first Arab-Israeli war had begun. Less than a day old, the state of Israel was immediately attacked on multiple fronts by the combined forces of neighboring Arab states: Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Just like Palestinian Arabs, the Arab states lacked a centralized command, and were almost as much at odds with each other as they were with the new state of Israel. There is no doubt in my mind that most Arab leaders felt a sense of solidarity with Palestinian Arabs, and their cause enjoyed massive popular support. The Arab street was speaking, and few leaders in the recently created Arab states dared to ignore it. This solidarity could have been the key to victory if the Arab efforts had a more meaningful cooperation. In addition, there was minimal coordination between the Palestinian resistance on the ground and invading Arab forces, with King Abdullah of Transjordan, nominally the commander of the Arab coalition forces, and Grand Mufti al-Husseini, nominally the head of Palestinian resistance movement, refusing to even speak with one another. Their mutual dislike was understandable. King Abdullah hoped to annex, with British approval, the Arab portion of what was left of Palestine, focusing mainly on the West Bank, and thus encroaching on al-Husseini's prerogatives. Syria also had little love for King Abdullah, as the ranks of Syrian officers were deeply infiltrated by the monarchists, who supported Abdullah's call for the unification of Transjordan and Syria under the rule of the Hashemite dynasty. And all Arab nations were fully aware of Abdullah's territorial aspirations in the West Bank, as well as his close connection to the deeply disliked Brits. Transjordan had one advantage. It alone knew why it was entering the war. All of the other countries entered the war with largely negative goals, of preventing the establishment of the State of Israel, while not allowing Abdullah to get ahead of his neighbors and preventing the Grand Mufti from establishing a solid power base in Palestine. While containing King Abdullah's territorial aspirations, other Arab countries knew that Transjordan had the best trained army, the Arab Legion. Thus, not inviting Jordan to this small anti-Israel party was ill-advised. In fact, the Arab League made the Jordanian King Abdullah the commander-in-chief of the coalition forces. At the same time, Egyptian generals refused to even meet with Abdullah, let alone take orders from him, which was a problem since Egypt contributed the largest contingent of soldiers to the Arab coalition. While he had the largest army, King Farouk of Egypt had plenty of his own problems, as Britain had a monopoly on the supply of weapons to Egypt, and Iraq for that matter. British authorities made sure that the Egyptian army would never become good enough to cause any problems to their former overlords. Besides, while the army looked good on paper, it had only been tested on the parade grounds, with Egypt itself only recently gaining independence. The Haganah, Israel's army, was also initially equipped and trained by British authorities, and many soldiers fought alongside the British Army during the Second World War. The Jewish Agency made a great effort to stockpile weapons and even managed to create their own weapons manufacturing facility. Despite the existence of separate paramilitary units, the Haganah was operating under a centralized military command, in coordination with civic and political authorities. The Arab armies had few of these advantages, and relied on the commonly accepted premise that once British troops withdrew, Arab armies would overwhelm the standalone Jewish forces in a few days, simply due to their massive numerical superiority. Jewish propagandists found this myth very convenient, and promoted the idea of a Jewish David versus Arab Goliath with great determination. The reality was very different. Most Arab armies were small to begin with, and none of the Arab neighbors were willing to commit 100% of their armed forces, with the exception of the Arab Legion, commanded by British General John Glubb, or as he was affectionately known as, Glubb Pasha. Many Arab units were inconsistently equipped and even more inconsistently trained. This generalization does hide the fact that some Arab forces, especially Egyptian and Iraqi, were trained and equipped following the British model, and were formidable foes to the State of Israel. The largest contingent of the combined Arab army was from Egypt, with a little over 10,000 men. Syria sent 2,500 soldiers, Iraq 3,000, Lebanon 3,000, and Jordan 4,500. At this point, the Haganah consisted of nearly 40,000 soldiers, a number which grew to 96,000 by the end of this conflict in December of 1948. These numbers aside, the math at that time must have looked very promising for Arabs, and equally menacing for the new state of Israel, with 40 million Arabs surrounding 500,000 Jews. At the start of the war, few international experts were betting on Israel. Okay now, let's get down to business.
Let's get down to business.
The war can be divided into 3 logical periods, with the first beginning on May 15th of 1948, and ending after the first ceasefire agreement brokered by the UN on June 11th. At the very beginning of the war, Israel was attacked on multiple fronts. The army of Transjordan entered into the Arab quarters of Jerusalem. The army of Iraq secured the northern part of the West Bank. But instead of rapidly advancing forward, they took a rather puzzling and prolonged break. At the same time, Egyptian units swept up from the Sinai, advancing towards Tel Aviv. With great difficulty, Israeli forces managed to halt the Egyptian advances only 20 miles from the city. Simultaneously, the Syrian and Lebanese forces entered into northern Palestine. This first phase of the war was the most difficult for Israel, as they were fighting on multiple fronts. Both sides were running out of ammunition, as the United Nations imposed a total weapons embargo in the region. While Arab countries found most European governments abiding by this rule, Israel found an unlikely ally in the Soviet Union, who wishfully saw some communist tendencies of the newly created Jewish state. and could be forgiven for such thoughts as kibbutz vaguely resembled Soviet collectivized farming. Thus, Stalin channeled a substantial amount of military hardware to Israel via Czechoslovakia. During the first truce, Israel had 28 days to get Soviet arms, and boosted their army to over 60,000 people. During this respite, another important development took place. As the UN imposed a complete weapons embargo, Israel was not supposed to receive any hardware or ammunition, their minor Czechoslovakian indiscretion aside. Despite the direct UN oversight, Irgun members brazenly defied this instruction, and attempted to unload an entire ship full of US ammunition in the port of Haifa. The new Israeli army, the Haganah, had no interest in getting into hot water with UN representatives, and opened fire on Irgun members and the boat. This event officially ended the existence of 4 separate military organizations in Israel: the Haganah, its elite unit Palmach, Irgun, and Lehi. After this incident, all of them were merged into one army, which received the name of Israel Defense Forces, or IDF. When the ceasefire ended on July 9th, the Israeli army was different in more than just name, presenting a highly unpleasant surprise to their opponents. The army was much larger, much better coordinated, and equipped. The Air Force was arguably the weakest link in this new structure, and was in desperate need of experienced fighter pilots. Over the next 3 weeks, Israel received several European volunteer pilots with considerable experience. The irony was that many of them were British, who were used to their Spitfires, and now needed to adapt to German Messerschmitt 109s, which were sent as part of the weapons supply from Czechoslovakia. During the second part of this war, the IDF used their superiority in morale, manpower, and weapons to decisively turn the tide on every front. First to fold were Syria and Lebanon, who quickly retreated behind their own borders. Then, Israel concentrated its efforts on the army of Egypt in the south. The United Nations resumed intensive diplomacy to reach another ceasefire.
A vote is taken and the Security Council orders both sides to stop the war in Palestine under pain of economic sanctions and military intervention.
And found an eager audience among the ammunition-starved Arab coalition. The second period of the First Arab-Israeli War ended, being the shortest one and lasting only 10 days. But those 10 days changed the Middle East forever. Israel's IDF fared well when fighting on multiple fronts, having learned how to quickly increase the size of the armed forces with highly trained reservists. These separate victories on multiple fronts were greatly facilitated by rising tensions between the members of the Arab coalition. With troops poorly trained and lacking a centralized command, many Arab soldiers felt betrayed by their own governments. This dissatisfaction would lead to an entire wave of revolutions that swept the Middle East after the war. The second ceasefire ended on October 14th, and military actions resumed. Immediately, the IDF completed the mopping up operation in the Galilee region, and kicked out the Arab Liberation Army as well as the remnants of Syrian and Lebanese armies. Now, it was Egypt's turn. A large detachment of Egyptian forces were surrounded in southern Palestine, pinned down for weeks, without reinforcements or adequate supplies. Egyptian soldiers were hopelessly outnumbered, and all but abandoned by their own country. Among the officers trapped in Fallujah were Gamal Abdel Nasser and Zechariah Mohi el-Din. These 2 young men would soon cause some serious trouble in Egypt, and would overthrow the monarchy. With no meaningful cooperation with other Arab armies, Egyptian troops were forced to withdraw from Palestine. The last Israeli offensive took place in the Negev desert, seizing territory all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba, thus paving the way for the future development of the port of Eilat. When the gunpowder finally settled by mid-November of 1948, the State of Israel took its final shape. Transjordan, which became simply Jordan, retained the West Bank, and Egypt held the Gaza Strip, which was the last Palestinian territory to remain in Arab possession. Palestine was no longer, and 750,000 Palestinians became refugees. The Israeli victory saved the young Jewish state from annihilation. This war, however, did not resolve the long-standing issues between all parties involved, only postponing the eventual resumption of mutual extermination attempts. While both the Civil War and the War of Independence solidified the existence of the State of Israel in the midst of moderately hostile neighbors, it also deprived Palestinians of their statehood, political leadership, and for many, the right to exist on the land of their ancestors. While I greatly enjoyed the research for this episode, I must admit that I found myself unprepared, unable to make any decisive conclusions. I think that I simply struggled with my instinct to cast a good versus evil type of verdict, since each side was both a hero and a villain. Researching this conflict, I felt sympathy and anger towards all sides. I found that it would be inconceivable to deny the people that had just went through the horrors of German concentration camps, as well as unending suffering in many parts of the world, its right to have a national homeland.
Außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
I also found the idea that the establishment of such a homeland was accompanied by the appropriation of Arab lands, as well as the deprivation of their right to a sovereign nation, equally unacceptable. Could the international community have done more to balance the needs of the Jewish people to have their homeland without allowing the development of a full-blown humanitarian crisis in Palestine? In theory, the answer is yes, but in practice, who would have spearheaded such efforts with Europe in post-war ruins? The US administration was initially hostile to the idea of creating an independent Jewish state. President Truman, besieged by Jewish lobbyists, later came to a different conclusion. In contrast, many in the US administration, including the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, yes, the same Marshall who gave the name to the European post-war economic recovery plan, were greatly concerned that the long-term consequences of US support for Israel would be a disaster for the US in the Middle East. Disaster. Curiously, this is exactly how Palestinians referred to the 1948 war. Al-Nakba, the disaster. Indeed, the war was disastrous for all Arab nations involved, causing many post-colonial regimes in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq to fall, as the new generation of Arab leaders replaced the old ones in a fury of frustration, with a greatly mismanaged and consequently lost war. This new generation of leaders would prove to be no less hostile to the State of Israel, which would have to fight again and again. The next war lasted only 6 days, but its consequences have been felt for 6 decades and counting. Thank you so much for watching the most intriguing military battles. Don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment down below. And please, join us for the next part of our special topic, the Suez Crisis and the Six-Day War. Marvelous as always, Amelia. Thank you so much for watching the most intriguing military battles. It is my profound desire for you to join me to watch the next part of this special topic, the Suez Crisis and the Six-Day War. Ta-ta for now, dear friend.